The dinner fiasco was finally at an end, as soon as the guards were reunited with their employers. Nick came over to us so I could tell him how things went while he was in the other room. It was quiet on his end, aside from Nightingale Nightshade's bodyguard leaving for a few seconds for a washroom break. The rest merely ate their meal. Luna silently demanded to be picked up. So I complied and followed behind the rest of the group while carrying a child down the hallway. Nightshade and Nightingale were speaking about something in hushed tones. An odd expression suddenly came over the taller man's face, and he kept glancing back towards Nick and I. Elizabeth had stayed back to speak with us, so I wasn't able to figure out what was troubling him. "You seem to be getting a large amount of attention from Webb. Is that because you're human, or is it something else?" she asked, as she tucked some hair behind her pointed ears, trying to be seductive. "I think it's because I don't really care about him. I bet he's been raised around people who think he's above everyone else. Having someone who won't look twice in his direction might bother him. I think if you just ignore him, he might start trying to gain your attention," I commented, while letting Luna shift to sitting on my shoulders. Elizabeth looked a bit surprised at the answer. She'd been chasing after powerful men trying to add that power to her family, but with no luck so far. Webb may be insulting the only human out of disgust, but it might also be because I wasn't falling down at his feet like everyone else. Nick was an agent, so he was a public servant of sorts. Even if he didn't pay much attention to Webb or anyone else in this party, he would still protect them if something happened. I was only a guest to the party. I mostly liked the guests besides Webb. If someone did arrange this all to put him in a vulnerable spot, he would be on his own for all I cared. She nodded and caught up to her guard, considering my answer. The next stop was down a flight of stairs to a grand theater for the promised play to end the night. Webb had already found a seat in the front. There were some empty balcony seats, but he didn't appear to want to waste the effort trying to find the stairs leading to them. The room was dark, and I was the only one having issues tripping over chairs trying to find a spot to sit. Luna had already jumped from my shoulders and started running down the aisles to burn off some of the sugar from dinner, when a hand landed on my shoulder in the dark room. I assumed it was Nick. Turning my head, I jumped when a different face was right next to my own. "Please speak with me after this play," Nightshade whispered so low I almost didn't hear him. He sounded worried. He left quickly, so I wasn't able to ask him what was troubling him so much that he felt the need to speak with me. I managed to wrangle Luna into a seat near Nick just as figures flickered on stage. "They're like the maid, sort of like holograms. We're the only people here," Luna explained as the play started. Honestly, I couldn't tell if it was good or not. The special effects were great, but it was in a language I didn't understand and dealt with a history going over 1,000 years back between two supernatural creature species I wouldn't have a clue about even if I understood the words. Luna tried explaining some of what was going on, but I couldn't wrap my head around it all. One of the creatures' head looked similar to those syrup bottles some breakfast restaurants put on the tables, so at least that was amusing. I should have become worried when Nightshade stood up. I assumed it was a washroom break based on the uncomfortable look on his face as he left the room. Nightingale followed behind, ensuring the one he protected wouldn't be alone at any point. As the minutes dragged on, the worry in the pit of my stomach became urgent. He should have been back by now. I got up and tried to leave a sleepy Luna with Nick, whispering I would be right back. Even under his mask, I could tell he didn't like the idea of me being alone, but he also didn't want to leave Luna behind. Picking up the sleepy child, all three of us started out of the room. The difference in lighting initially blinded me for a few seconds. I felt Luna pushed into my arms while my eyes adjusted as I heard Nick move around. When I could see again, I was met with a sight I dreaded and had hoped wouldn't happen. On his back in the middle of the red patterned carpet was Nightshade. His large wings pressed against the floor and his black hair was tangled into them. His hand reached out, his fingers extended, so close to reaching the hand of Nightingale, who was also collapsed on the floor. Each lay there with a stab wound on their chest and neither appeared to be breathing. I rushed over, not knowing how to help. Luna let out a gasp. Despite how mature they acted, they were still a child. Nick had already checked the two over. He looked up and shook his head, telling me everything I needed to know. This wasn't right. How did something like this happen right next to a room with not only Nick, but many other powerful creatures? Someone should have noticed something. Nick thought it was best to call everyone in and go over what to do next. He didn't touch the bodies, aside from placing Nightshade's cold hand into the hand of his servant, which he had so desperately tried to reach before he was killed. When Nick called for the rest to come out into the hallway, the magic holograms flickered and the lights inside the theater turned on. I know it was all controlled by magic, but it felt as if someone else was inside the building. There were some gasps from the girls when they saw what was waiting for them outside. They didn't want to marry Nightshade, but they had liked him well enough to be moved by his death. Webb stayed cold and silent as the two girls started to talk in nervous voices. They asked the questions everyone wanted to know. Who could have done such a thing? Why? And how? I looked around the hallway for clues, only to find none. That was somewhat of a clue in itself. There was no struggle. Nightshade could have fought his attacker, but he didn't, since we didn't move his body. It was hard to tell if he had been stabbed in the front, or if the blade went into his back and all the way through. If he was caught from behind, that would explain why he didn't fight. But I couldn't help but wonder how one stab would be enough to kill a creature like himself. Nick had his throat torn open and the lower half of his body exploded. And yet he had healed, not to mention that he was on the weaker end of all the creatures I had come across so far. As I was thinking, Nick silently went over to the wall, which had delicate wallpaper covering the plaster. Without warning, he started to rip it apart with his bare hands, stunning everyone. After he made a sizable hole, he stepped aside to let everyone see what he was getting at. A dull-looking metal was hidden behind the plaster. The others knew what it was, but Nick explained for my sake. The house appears to be lined with iron. It dulls supernatural creatures' senses. It's the reason why no one noticed Nightshade was killed, or could sense an attacker. Before we arrived, did anyone else check the building? He asked the group. I sent my servant out when we arrived. He did not find anyone, so we waited in the room as the rest arrived. But the murderer could have slipped in afterwards, and we couldn't sense it because of the iron. Clear spoke up, looking and sounding sick. Why did Nightshade even leave the room? I was getting bored and almost got up to take a walk. This could have been myself, Elizabeth said. As she looked at her feet in red-strapped heels, she kicked them off, not feeling as if she needed to impress others any longer. It was his dinner. There was a garnish on his plate that greatly upsets his species. I wanted to warn him, but I've been to dinners with him before. He has never left anything on his plate and is always the first one to rush off to the washroom. The person who set up this party must have known that and wanted to separate him from the rest, Clear explained. And I found that to be some pretty useful information. So, this dinner was a cover-up to kill him. He's never troubled anyone before. It's hard to believe, but it's done, and we should leave and figure out the rest afterwards. We all agreed to the suggestion of trying to get out. We didn't know for certain if Nightshade was the target. Being inside the mansion with a murderer none could sense was a bad idea. We all stuck together, the two girls closer to Nick and I than Webb. He strode along, not concerned in the slightest. I felt terrible. Nightshade was a decent guy. We left him behind, thinking it was best not to disturb the scene for when other agents came to investigate. It felt wrong not to bring him with us, or to even cover their bodies, as much as I wanted to do so. I couldn't do anything for the man other than call in for some help. We quickly found our way to the front door. Nick started towards it, but was moved out of the way by Webb, as he wanted to be the center of attention like always. It seemed. He grabbed the door handle and pulled, but nothing happened. As he struggled, the girls were getting scared as if the killer would jump out at any second. Webb was cursing by the time he stepped aside to order his servant to blow down the door. Nick told him to stop, but Webb refused. Everything felt as if it moved in slow motion as the white-haired servant tossed a blast at the door, only to have it come right back at him. It exploded, and Nick flipped over the table he had found the mask on earlier to protect us from the blast. I stood stunned, never seeing a creature use magic without drawing a circle before. Webb was tossed back since he had been too close to the blast of pure white light. The other servants did their job and protected the girls. Webb's servant was also knocked back, his arm cracking hard against the floor. His entire body was smoking as he coughed, trying to sit up. We couldn't get out, even if they were all powerful creatures in their own right. All of us had been locked inside a mansion with a killer on the loose. When that fact sunk in, the girls knew there was safety in numbers and huddled closer to the only agent inside the building, hoping he could do something. Webb sat up, all composure lost. He was stomping over to his injured servant, face red in anger. He gave a swift kick to the fallen man, and I was moving before I was even aware of it. Nick reached out to drag me back as I would not stand a chance against Webb. But when he reached down to take a fistful of the servant's long hair to lift him off the ground so he could berate him, Nick had to wrap an arm around my waist and physically lift me away so I wouldn't get myself killed. We should all go back to a safe room and talk about our options, Nick said to the group. He was the only calm one out of all of us, without any other ideas. The rest agreed. Nick still needed to keep a hand on the back of my shirt so I wouldn't charge at Webb for letting his poor servant get up on his own and limp behind, cradling his slowly healing arm. We headed back into the room where we had all met. Each person went to the spot where they had waited before. The empty space near the bookshelves caused a twinge in my chest. I felt like a failure for not being able to protect the pair. Webb sat in the chair by the window, livid and disheveled. His servant was standing next to him, meekly, healed, but still emotionally distressed. Can't we just wait until someone comes to get us? The three of us are from important families. We can't be gone for too long without someone noticing, Elizabeth said from her spot near the fireplace. Our families approved of this invite and told us to be here. Either the one who got us here fooled them, or they wanted us to be here. Clear ventured. Speak for yourselves. No one could fool my family, and I am their most important child. They would not lead their son into a trap or send me into an unwanted situation, Webb said in a harsh tone. Both girls were way beyond their infatuation with him. They both gave the same disgusted look. If their families sent them to be killed in a locked mansion, then why were Luna, Nick, and myself here? Were we going to be blamed for their murders? Then again, Nick did say the corporation approved of this dinner invite. Trying to find the answer to what was going on would be impossible without more information to go on. Those three appear to be the most suspicious out of all of us. None of our families have had issues with each other in the past. The only outsiders are the ones most likely to be working against us, Webb pointed out. I opened my mouth to speak, but Clear beat me to it. Are you saying a human, a child, and an agent that only protects others from supernatural threats could pull of such a thing? They do not have any power, nor connections. If the corporation wanted to punish us in some way, they would not go about it in such an underhanded method. A family with such power, however. She was looking between Webb and Elizabeth with a guarded look on her face. What are you implying? Do you really think I have any motives for wanting to end your lives? Webb said, shaking his head. Well, actually, you did point out that your family wouldn't be fooled and wouldn't send you into a trap if someone set this up to kill Nightshade. You're the one with the most likely motive and means to do so. Maybe you were worried he might be able to impress one of the girls enough for them to marry him over you. You really seem to be the type to pull a stunt like this and flaunt your talents. If it wasn't for the backfire at the front door, I would be convinced you were somehow behind this. But I really think this all has to do with an outside source we're not aware of, I explained, as much as I hated to admit it. Webb didn't appear to be behind the murders. He was an arrogant prick who would have killed his competition without blinking an eye. Nightshade didn't appear to be a threat. But if one of the girls he had refused had fallen back on the quiet man after being rejected, he would probably take that as an insult. If that could be said about myself, then it could be said about these women here. The invite could have been won from their families. They could be planning to impress me with a show of power by fighting off a hired killer. This whole thing could be a setup, trying to win my favor in order to win my hand in marriage, Webb said smugly, as if he enjoyed the idea of it. Both Clear and Elizabeth looked flushed and ready to start defending themselves, each stuttering out a defense when I shrugged at the idea. I don't feel as if either girl would try such a thing. Webb cut me off before I was able to explain my reasoning with a snarl on his face. His voice quickly cut off my own. Are you thinking with your brain or with your dick? Thankfully, he was cut off as well. Nick, who was silent this entire time, brought out the orchestra and with one swift movement sent a shockwave crashing against the window behind Webb. It bounced off, getting sent back towards Nick, who simply sidestepped it. I felt the force of the wind from the attack. By the time the blow crashed into the wall behind us, leaving a deep cut in the plaster, the sword was already put away. Nick was still wearing the mask up until that point. He pulled it off his face so he could speak with Webb as an equal and not simply as a bodyguard. I got tired of your voice. As it stands, we could argue for hours over the possible motives. We simply do not have the right information to prove or disprove any theories. I propose myself, Skylar, and Luna should search this building for signs of another person. If we can eliminate the possibility of another killer, we may come back to this discussion, Nick said in a calm voice. Everyone was too stunned by his previous actions to respond. Webb sat, hands slightly shaking from having an attack directed towards him, his servant as pale as his hair for not being able to predict Nick's movements and stop him. My partner was not trying to harm Webb, but to get everyone to focus on his suggestion. In all honesty, it may have been the only way to get everyone's attention. What if one of us is behind the murder? You want us to wait inside a room with them? Elizabeth brought up, nearly hysterical. If the one who planned this and is planning on killing you is inside the room, they are outnumbered. Can any of you take on 4 creatures at once? Nick brought up. They all looked to each other knowing the answer. As long as no one left the room, it was safe until we returned. Even if Webb and his servant wanted to attack and kill the girls, he would need to deal with both of them and their bodyguards at once. With such an enclosed space, they would need to be careful not to let a magic blast hit the wall near the window, or else it would be knocked back. At least that answered the question of trying to break down a wall or break a window to get outside. For a short while, the group would be fine if we left. I was not going to leave Luna alone and knew it was safer to bring the child with us. The reason as to why Luna was even here was still a mystery. It was a reluctant response, but they agreed to let us leave to search the building. I was carrying Luna again as I looked over my shoulder to give the group one last look. Webb was silent but angrier than I'd seen him before. I feared he might take that out on his servant. Once we figured this all out, we needed to do something about those two. I followed behind Nick so we could start clearing rooms to ensure there wasn't a killer on the loose. It was nerve-wracking checking every new room, just as he did in the lab where we rescued Luna from. He sealed each room after we cleared it with a written circle spell on the door. That way the killer wasn't able to sneak back into a room we had already checked. To my surprise, Luna offered that it would be faster if we split up to check the rooms. The child could make the same spells, and we wouldn't be too far away from each other. The small creature could protect me until Nick came over to help. I didn't like the idea of it, but when Nick nodded, I agreed too. I trusted his judgment that Luna could hold their own for a little while if needed. I should have requested my gun but didn't because this was meant to be a dinner party, not a murder mystery dinner. Nick was checking the rooms next to use as I was carrying Luna around. Each room was large and filled with expensive antique furniture, but no signs of life. I keep hearing about you guys being able to sense other creatures. What's that about? I asked. We were looking for a killer and making conversation might not be the best idea, but the question was bothering me. It's similar to sight or smell. Creatures can just feel the magic inside others. It's called magic, but it's just like a life force, some sort of power. I guess humans have it too, but it's very minor and you can't use it in the same way we can use ours. The stronger creatures, of course, have larger stores of power. It's always growing while they live. The older creatures are normally stronger, but a lot of different factors go into creatures having magic levels, Luna explained as we walked. That sounded similar to the few facts I'd heard before. Luna's knowledge was pretty impressive. I almost felt bad over the idea of a child being more useful in this situation than myself. As we entered a new room, a full-sized mirror startled us. It wasn't the first time our reflection scared us. This place was full of them. I only noticed it after we separated from the group and became more of a target. There was no map for this mansion. Without one, it was hard to tell how long looking at each room may take. We finally finished one floor. Nick checked in on us before we tackled another hallway. He was worried he might run out of markers to make spells. Luna actually had a larger internal magic source than him and could take over if that happened. He thanked the small child for the offer only to get an upturned nose as an answer. Luna still didn't like Nick all that much. When we started to search more empty rooms on opposite sides of the hallway, I asked about that. Nicky is a good guy. Why are you so against him? I asked while nearly tripping over another mirror set by the door. He was going to kill me. If you weren't there, he would have. It's hard to get over that. I really couldn't argue against that. Someday these two would get along. I just couldn't force it. As long as they could work together right now, it was fine. Yet another room was cleared. My stress levels were through the roof, thinking it was only a matter of time until we came across a bloodthirsty killer. A faint crashing sound came from down the hallway. I ran out of the open door to try and listen to where the sound was coming from. Another booming crash came and Nick was already darting towards the stairs. As we ran, the sound kept getting louder. I recognized the hallway we traveled down and knew the sounds were coming from the front door. I turned the corner to see the state the front room was in. The walls scarred from attacks, and cuts in the hardwood flooring. It was as if some sort of creature gone on a rampage. The only spot spared from damage was the front door. Webb stood, face flushed in rage, his suit jacket open and tie tossed aside, the look on his face completely unhinged. His servant was on the ground, injured and bleeding from slowly healing cuts on his body. Murmur, get up and break down this door. I am not spending another second in this place. Webb raged, pointing towards the solid wooden door. The sounds were of them trying to break out of this place. The servant attempted to stand, only to collapse back to the ground in silent pain. Nick was watching, thinking of what to do, when his servant didn't get back up. Webb stormed over to grab a fistful of white hair and forcefully lifted the injured man off the ground while screaming, "It's just a door. What the hell did we breed you for?" Oh, now this was the last straw. I shoved Luna into Nick's arms and in a blind rage went over to Webb. I reeled back and punched him in the side of the face as hard as I could. My knuckles took the toll, but I didn't care. Webb stumbled back, unharmed but shocked from being struck. His hand released the servant, strands of long white hair still tangled in his fingers. "If you touch him again, I'll find a way to kill you," I said through gritted teeth. I stood between them, Webb looking down, frozen in place. There was no power behind this threat. I was only human after all, and it was really none of my business. Even so, I could not stand by and watch a quiet, gentle person being abused. Webb was far stronger, but he looked at me as if I could follow through with my promise. I'd confused him. Creatures in his world acted based on their power. If they didn't have any, they did not act. He knew I couldn't actually hurt him, but because I threatened it, It made him think I somehow could. The contradiction kept him in place as I got down to my knees to look over the equally shocked, bruised servant. Your name is Murmur, right? Are you all right? I asked in a much gentler tone that I used with Webb. A slow nod came. He too was confused by my actions. I dreaded the thought this might be the first time anyone ever acted concerned for him. At least his wounds healed fast. When we got out of here, I needed to do my best to get this guy free of Webb. There needed to be a way to do so. Bright blue eyes nearly glittering stared through silky hair. He wanted to say something but only murmured something I didn't hear. We're going back to the others. Webb snapped finally and started to walk away, expecting his servant to follow. With one last look, Murmur got up to quickly fall into pace. Nick was also frozen by the interaction, Luna in one arm and hand near the golden hilt in case Webb fought back. He thought I was going to die for getting involved, and I almost did. The look in Luna's eyes made it easy to tell I'd done something stupid, but also a little bit cool. Instead of going back to clear the rooms, we went to go check on the girls and to find out what made Webb snap. What we returned to was one of the worst cases. Elizabeth was alone in the room, one side of her face red and eyes wet from tears. She was sitting by the fireplace almost about to cry when she saw us. I rushed over to her wanting to know what happened and where the other three went. What happened? Are you all right? I asked as I got down on her level. Webb and Murmur came back into the room. She gave him a nasty look that told me everything I needed to know. Through tears and sharp teeth, she spoke. Webb snapped. We were talking, trying to figure out what's going on. He wanted to go try the front door again, but when we tried to stop him, he hit me. Clear went after him, and I let my bodyguard go as well. If he attacked her, I wanted her to have extra protection until you could come back. Murmur couldn't look at us. Webb crossed his arms, not acknowledging how much of a dick he was being. He'd put everyone in danger with his little stunt. Elizabeth was left all alone, and Clear was somewhere separated from everyone else. At least she had two guards, but the fact we didn't come across her on the way back worried me.